The totalitarian seed is in every ideology, from left to right, conservative to progressive. The seed of totalitarianism is there, waiting to sprout. Ideology, it's the logic of an idea, a total rationalization, beginning with a premise that gives us a ready-made answer for every problem we can find. A whole system that explains the world for us. It becomes a closed system. Ideas make the world. Ideology claims the world and captures the world, holding it into place. We're going to be talking about ideology, the logic of an idea. This is the Great Rehumanization. Thank you for joining me. So, ideology, the logic of an idea. It's right there in the very word, ideology. All of us get the sense that some ideas carry heavier cargo than others. These are the very ideas we commit to, the ones that capture us, those heavy ones. At least we think they're heavy. That's what we're here to talk about. We need to discuss not only how we commit to an idea, or a set of ideas, but we need to examine the boundary lines where an idea stops being useful and starts becoming dangerous. So the intuition is pretty simple, right? Some ideas can heal us. Some ideas definitely hurt us. We can build bridges, or we can burn villages. So that intuition is the engine of everything I'm going to be talking about. Simple enough, right? There are bad ideas and there are good ideas. So I'm not really here to compile a list of the good and the bad ideas and to talk about the moral requirements for what makes an idea good or bad. I'm not here to shame anybody for having a particular belief or idea, belief system. We need conservatives and progressives to make the world go round. I'm like that. But I want to inspect the mechanisms by which any idea, even an idea that seems good at first, hardens into this total system that directs all of our behaviors and policies, but all too often leads to horrible violence, atrocities, totalitarian regimes. So yeah, this is about ideology, the logic of an idea. It's about the logic and the lure, because it's a lure too. There's definitely a coherent logic. It becomes a rationalization, but there's something about it that lures us too. So this is about how we get hooked on an idea, and then we rationalize it. No matter what trouble we get reeled into, no matter how badly we hurt ourselves and others, we commit to that ideology, make it part of our identity, graft ourselves into it, lose ourselves, and it becomes really hard to get out of that once we attach ourselves to it. So ideology, the way we're going to talk about it, it's what happens when an idea undergoes metamorphosis and becomes a sealed circuit, a reasoning process that begins with a claim and then excludes all of the messy data and evidence around it that contradicts it. So it wraps itself in the dialect of reason, makes it more defensible, diagrammable, teachable. That apparent clarity, right? Once we are committed to an ideology, all we can think of is the logic of that idea. We get stuck in that tunnel. All the peripheral vision disappears. We only see straight ahead. And we're bound to that ideology. But the point is, everybody outside that tunnel, they seem like they can't follow the logic. And we don't get why they don't understand how simple it is. And then we say things like, it's only common sense. So the clarity, once you become committed to an ideology, everything becomes clear. And it's clear that the ideology itself is logical and that everybody else should see that too. That coherence, starting with the premise. You see, you could have an ideology that goes like this. Well, people are poor. They have all the opportunities they need. The only reason you should be poor, or could possibly be poor, is because you're lazy. For anyone who thinks that way, all of that seems like airtight logic to them. It's because every other possibility and variable has been sealed off. And that one is pretty simple. You can think of all kinds of reasons why a person might be poor, but yet we still have people pounding the table, insisting that every single person who is poor is just lazy. You see? So, when we're in that ideological tunnel, it's all depth looking forward and total blindness to everything peripheral. All nuance becomes noise. Exception eventually gets regarded as treason, right? So everything seems so coherent and clear to the person who's committed to the ideology that anything outside of it seems so irrational that the next leap is, oh, that person who doesn't agree with me, they're treasonous or they're evil. So the critical move we need to make, we have to understand that ideology isn't just like this generic roster of propositions, various declarations, like a party platform. I'm on the left, so I believe this, and this. I'm a liberal progressive, so I believe. That's not what ideology really is. When we commit to an ideology, that list of propositions, those are the little connecting points of rationalizations. Here's how it works. It's an operational logic. It's a cognitive regime. Okay, you start with a premise. Back to all poor people are lazy. And it explains why you have poor people, for example. And then you extend that into an all-purpose map of reality. Everybody who is successful deserves all of their success, and they all did it on the level and worked hard to get there, and everybody who's not as successful is just a lazier, less capable person. You see, it starts to become a map of reality. Then you start making policies and voting for that kind of stuff, and you might even resent people who don't agree with you, and you might want to punish them, and so on. So, a necessary critique of inequality, even, to flip that could turn into a totalizing theory of politics. We could go really far in the extreme and say, well, we have to take everybody's property and redistribute it. It seems really banal. Like, until you watch how quickly any decent idea can be weaponized. I was talking a minute ago, my example was people who think all poor people are lazy. Let's flip that and say you want to help all poor people. Well, is it really a good idea to take everybody's property, make a central authority, and delegate a central power to the task of taking everybody's property and then redistributing it? We've seen that show before. We're going to get to that. Any idea can become dangerous when it refuses to register the world's actual complexity, right? Things are not simple. Ideology makes everything really simple, gives us simple solutions. And then when we lean into really simple solutions and ignore the complexity and the context, we get into real trouble. The 20th century is proof of that. So why is it so hard to see? Why is it so hard to see when we're in a trap? We already touched on that. It's because, in part, everything is really coherent. Once you commit to an ideology, the logic is airtight, it's coherent. Everybody else seems wrong. But let's get a little bit deeper. All right, we swim in these ideas like fish in the ocean, and we just don't see how we're sustained in that environment. When we talk about ideology, for example, it seems like we're always using it in a sense where we're saying it's something they are doing. So it's always this oppositional thing. It's always a criticism of those we don't agree with. So we see this with propaganda. All the information that comes at us that we agree with, we hardly ever say that's propaganda, even though that's exactly what it is. Any information that's designed to get us to react, to act, or condition us, or condition an attitude in us, whether we agree with it or not, is propaganda. And one of the things the Great Rehumanization is going to focus on is propaganda, because propaganda is the force behind all of the dehumanization. It's the force that binds us to the worldly mess, basically. Not to digress too far, but ideology is very similar. We seldom say, oh, my ideology, or the ideology that I'm stuck in. We're always pointing at somebody else saying, you're ideological, or finding a problem with their ideologies. We spare ourselves ideological labels, and it's tactical. That's ideology's craft. It's the self-authentication, where we get to say, look, what I believe, it's really self-explanatory. It's just so obvious. You should see it too. All of this gets us stuck. We can't see the trap that we're in. We're emotional. So feelings of righteousness and fear and disgust, we tuck that all into this file labeled logic. We don't see that it's emotional or sentimental. You see, feeling motivates conviction. Conviction will put locks on that little filing cabinet where we tuck all of those feelings into, the force of which gives us the feeling of proof and logic. We are really tunneled into the operational logic of ideology. So when we're on the inside of that tunnel, we see the linear sequence steps. Everything works. It's all coherent. And then we say, look, it's inevitable. It's obvious. Why can't you see it too? Of course, it's inevitable when you're on the interior, from the unexamined premise, the unexamined point of view, tunneled in. Any facts that come to contradict, they're exceptions and fabrications, corruptions. Again, we label other people as treasonous or evil for not getting in that tunnel with us. And our entire culture is very expert at accusing others of ideology. This is all over the place. Woke ideology, market ideology, identity ideology, and so on. Again, it's the finger-pointing aspect of it. We don't bring that label to ourselves, but we point at others because doing so serves two purposes. It allows us to identify our enemies, and it gives us our tidy moral map, our map to be able to determine who's treasonous, who's the enemy. That's so important for us to feel our own righteous indignation, to feel better than other people, to make ourselves more human and evolved while we dehumanize and take the dignity from others. Oh, look, they don't believe what we believe. They're not on our ideological team. It's because they're treasonous and they're evil and they're corrupted. What we end up doing is we create this entire grammar of fear. Ideology becomes this label weapon. And then we point at other people's ideologies to shut down any debate. You're just an ideologue committed to an ideology. And then our own movements, in our own tunnels, we consolidate our own convictions into doctrines. And then we call ourselves courageous and principled and truth tellers. So that double standard is ideology's real victory. Locking us in. The difference between an idea creating the world, an idea igniting a conversation around it, and an ideology, the logic of an idea, the rationalization of an idea to a conclusion that solves all the world's problems, gives us all the answers, gives us the tidy moral map, and shows us all the enemies. That's ideology's victory. When it's claimed us and claimed the world and locked it into place for us and locked us into it. When an idea becomes this communal natural law, then that's when the stakes really explode. That's when it really gets intense, when we start pretending an ideology is historically inevitable or necessary. It's when we pretend that it's a scientific inevitability. It's natural law. It would be useful maybe to touch on religion and ideology, and that's going to be really useful going forward, because religion becomes really ideological and ideology becomes really religious. They share a lot of ground. But religion traditionally points to an authority that is not of this world and to sacred texts. Ideology flattens everything into a more vertical horizon and tells us that we can find all the answers right here and implement them right now, and we have to. So there are some nuances and differences that are really, really big, but we have to talk about that common ground. The religious aspect of ideology becomes that real fervent belief that history, human nature, and science can lend authority to our ideologies, give them seals of inevitability. We say things like, people are just like this. Well, all you have to do is look at history. And then the one that's really common is, oh, it's just common sense. It's just common sense that everything I think is common sense. The phrases shift around, but this structure, it doesn't change. The claim to certainty expels all dissent. And then you get faith's inflexibility. You get the dogma added to the secular absolutism. So secular absolutism and religious devotion to it. It's a powerful combination. We can see it in all the totalitarian movements. So what I'm talking about, it's not abstract at all. All the totalitarian movements. History is a ledger. Okay, especially the 20th century. It's a warning not far away, right there in front of us. And don't listen to the influencers saying it doesn't matter.
Yeah, we don't have to care. Why? I don't care about Hitler. Why would I care?
I'm not going to name names, but there are a lot of people out there claiming that knowing history is not that important. Even the history of our grandfathers and great-grandparents and so on. It's crucially important. We're going in the wrong direction, okay? We need to just look at the 20th century, just to see how these ideas harden into systems that measure and classify and then eliminate. Measure, classify, eliminate. That's really, really important. I got a story to tell you really soon. Something that happened yesterday. But we get class enemies, racial categories, dissenters, all these things deemed variables to be corrected, to be removed, to be eliminated. You see, Nazism, National Socialism wrapped mass murder in destiny and purity. Stalinism bureaucratized terror under historical necessity. Colonial ideologies rationalized dispossession, exploitation, suggesting scientific, natural hierarchies. None of these began as these cartoon monsters. They became grievances and narratives and even some plausible analysis here and there. Right? Marxism with the situation and plight and the alienation of the worker, very plausible, even valid. But they accrued into moral and institutional force, the power of the state, rationalizations. And when rationalizations become method and action, lethal action is next. Terror is next. Ideology becomes an engine of atrocity. That's the biggest lesson of ideology from the 20th century. And as I started at the beginning, every ideology contains the seed of totalitarianism. It's a stark thesis. It comes straight from Hannah Arendt. And I'll say it again, Jacques Ellul, Hannah Arendt. Many others, my people in my personal life, grandfather's friends. I have a lens that I get from my faith and my influences. I don't get it from power or ideology, at least as best as I try. I interrogate the ideological leanings as much as possible. A digression, but here's the deal. That comes from Hannah Arendt, the seed of totalitarianism. Not every ideological person is going to become a butcher, okay, a mass murderer or a bootlicker. But the internal logic of every ideology, it gives you that invitation. It gives us the invitation, extends its hand. If you have a framework, an ideological framework that claims to explain history, morality, and all social relations, then the question you sooner or later are going to face is, who's going to implement this truth? And eventually it's some small cohort, people you can't trust, who seize the reins of power and the machinery of the state. And they get to decide who implements truth. Degrades quickly into a system of just pure terror, lawlessness. Truth depends on whatever the leader says and whatever it requires to stay him in, to keep him in power. The seductive answer, right, to who's going to implement this, to who's going to command institutions, it turns the moral clarity of that ideology into the administrative machinery. Let's just say ambitious actors, flawed and sinful men usually, who aren't thinking about the better welfare of their neighbors. When these actors come across ideology, sometimes they might not even be that committed to it. They just see the mobilizing force of it. So we do have charismatic autocrats who shift the ideological, let's say, needle quite a bit, using what's ever useful. That's exactly what the Nazis did. They consolidated and appropriated the entire ideological spectrum. We'll talk about that too. All the digressions, all the things I touch on are, just branches on a big tree with roots and leaves and fruit. It's a big conversation, the Great Rehumanization. It really is. If you look left and right, basically, in the 20th century, on the ideological spectrum, you're going to see some symmetry. You're going to be able to fold it. I'm not making a moral equivalence, okay? I'm not going to reduce particular crimes to equal culpability in identical contexts. No. But I'm going to make a structural observation that monisms of left and right can converge on the same techniques. Purge, concentrate power, obliterate, pluralism. If you turn left to avoid the right, you're going to go in a circle. You turn right to avoid the left, you're going to go in a circle. And the 20th century's violence shows mirror corridors of terror. Stalinism on the left, Nazism on the right. Democracies survive, right? They survive when they preserve contestation, negotiation, legal pluralism. But when compromise is recast as corruption, the brakes come off. And this would be a good place to point out, the old saying associated with Bismarck and others, that politics is the art of the possible, the art of the compromise. Phrased slightly differently here and there, but politics, the art of the possible. And what that basically means is there's always going to be a give and take. Always. There always has to be a compromise. What is truly possible means that no side is going to win. Everybody's going to give an inch. That's the only real possibility in getting anything done politically, is a give and take. So when you remove the art of the possible, that's when we're talking about lawlessness. And that might be confusing when I say that a totalitarian state is lawless, because the superficial impulse would be, well, that's the most strict type of law. No. Law is on the books, it's in the courts, it's in the judiciary, it's established, and there's a process to it. Lawlessness is exactly when all of the decisions and the power reside in a committee or one man, and they make the law. Not the same for everybody, but the only real anchor to the law is what keeps those committees and that tyrant in power. You see, that's going to be an important thing to talk about. The art of the possible, okay? Let's talk about that for just 1 second, because what ideology does. So politics should be the art of the possible, but ideology insists that the impossible is inevitable, necessary, and the only possibility. You see? So it's a grand delusion. Ideology it eventually seals itself off, so there is no compromise, no give and take. So no longer the art of the possible. So what is realistic isn't even considered anymore. The tunnel of ideology digs so deeply downwards, it becomes a rationalization that leads straight to the darkest depths of that delusion I just talked about. The insistence that what is impossible, that one group of people can define everything and get their way with everything, that pathology becomes so hard to dig out of. If it's dug too far, totalitarianism becomes inevitable, and you get a state built on lawlessness and ruled by pure terror. And I'm using severe descriptives here, but they can't be severe enough. The stakes are really high. My language has to match it. Okay? There was another digression I wanted to make, too, while I'm on it. So yesterday, I looked at my Facebook page, and there's a guy in there that I follow, and let's just use a big brush. He and I probably, when it's all said and done, and we're in the final stage of the ballot, when the ballot's in front of us, we're going to vote for the same person. I would say 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10. But the guy posted something that, it's very typical. I'm not going to put him down for posting it. I get it. And I may have posted the same thing 10, 15 years ago. But my thinking has changed. And it has everything to do with what I'm talking about. What he posted was a study that was published in the Scientific American publication, magazine. It was about essentially, I'll give it to you in a nutshell, that the conservative brain, studies show the amygdala is a certain size, etc., and conservative politics are based on fear, and that's because conservatives and liberals have different brains. But the conceit and the reason why the man posted it essentially was to say, well, people are MAGA because their brains are inferior to ours. I mean, that was the conceit of all of it. That was the conceit, if you want to just cut to the chase. Now, I pushed back against that. For everything we're talking, every reason I'm doing this podcast and talking about ideology, my opposition to totalitarianism and this tunneling our way forward, just to really get into that, I pushed back on it in a comment, and I touched on some history, but the main point I made was we have to be really careful about this. I had a friend, and I talked about seeing this book on my friend's coffee table. I go to his house to give him a guitar lesson, and he's got a book on the coffee table that says The Liberal Mind, and I forget the subtitle, but it was written by a doctor, and it was so scientific. But it basically described liberals as being mentally ill and ruining society because of it. My friend here, older guy, psychologist, right? I immediately kind of pushed back on that. What? So my grandfather's mentally ill, I'm mentally ill, and then he starts going into a thing about narcissism and liberals and how it's proven in scientific proof that liberals are narcissists and all this other stuff. So in my comment on the guy's post, so just to catch up, the guy posted, a guy who I agree with politically posted this study from Scientific American that was basically saying, look, the conservative brain is MAGA, blah, 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 because they're so fearful and their brains are inferior to our liberal brains. That's basically the study. So I commented back like, no, see, the right does this too, and here's why it's dangerous, etc., etc. So then a random person decides to jump in to the intellectual deep end, and she says right away, respectfully, she says something along the lines of, I'll try to get it as much as I can here. Respectfully, I would like to know how many peer-reviewed studies you've read about this issue. And I think you're telling us exactly who you are by what you're saying here. Now, following everything I'm talking about the dangers of ideology, let's just look at that peon of a comment. All right? Really, she, from what I was saying there, commenting on the dangers of why these studies don't work, she somehow figured out who I am as a person. Everything about me. She figured it out. And I was, oh yeah, this is what she said. You're telling us more about yourself than you would like to. So she read into my core identity from me pushing back against leaning into pseudoscience, to use the exact description. Pseudoscience, trying to find a scientific basis for our ideological leanings, which is exactly what the Nazis did. Race science. I mean, it's a terrible path to go down. Eugenics. It's the same exact thing. These people are inferior because here's my scientific proof. I've coined a new word, ideonaturalization, or ideonaturalism. It's the ideological move to close oneself into that tunnel. Look, these people are inferior to us. I got the science to prove it. I mean, it's so incredibly dangerous. I'll talk about it. I'll get in a little bit more detail why, but first let me just get back to this woman's little comment. So she says, she knows everything about me. But let's start with have I read peer-reviewed stuff about this? Okay, besides the othering and the ideonaturalism, we can talk about this for a second. How do I know that it's pseudoscience? Okay, well, without going through the peer-reviewed process itself and talking about the criticism of such science, let's just talk about the practical application of it here on the ground. First of all, there's no such thing as left and right. There are tendencies. Okay, but for an example, let's just blow this up right away. There are people who are fiscally conservative, who don't like taxes, but yet are socially liberal, don't have any problem with gay marriage, and so on and so forth. There are people who don't fall left or right. How do you sort that out? That's the most superficial layer to this. What I had said in the comments was, look, if I ask you your zip code, I can pretty much tell you who you voted for. That doesn't speak to your brain structure. That speaks to your indoctrination, to your cultural influences. From there, we can talk about how those left-right cultural influences, the left and right spectrum from culture to culture is totally different altogether. So who is left and right in one country is not going to be the same in another country. The values are different. The nuances are different. We could do this all day long. All right. How many people voted for Donald Trump that formerly voted for both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama? A heck of a lot of people. We can take MAGA and look at MAGA altogether. Where's their ideological consistency? What makes them right? What makes them right-leaning? Well, the overall big tendencies. But is that because of their brain structure? No. Again, I could ask somebody their zip code. You see, it's all about opportunities, circumstances, what your family taught you, what your family didn't teach you, who you were around, and those things more likely influence the brain structure than the brain structure informs the politics. So you're damn right I'm going to say it's pseudoscience. And I hope you can understand the passion in where my voice is going right now, because I think it's insanely dangerous to do that. Here's my scientific proof that you think the way you do because your brain is inferior to mine. And that was the conceit. That was the move the man was making. There's no doubt about it. If he was completely honest, he'd say that. And I bet you he would. He would say, yeah, I was putting them down as inferior mentally. And maybe that was the wrong move. It is the wrong move. It is the wrong move because we need to always have the possibility that we can change people's minds, that we can fix the culture and the diseases in our culture. And we do. The history is not all bleak and stark and horrible. There are examples all over the place of people meeting new people, exposed to different things, getting to experience life differently, to have different experiences that enable them to gain more perspective. That in turn changes the neurocircuitry. You see, we have neuroplasticity. And that blows all of these stupid little ideologically motivated studies of brain structure out of the water immediately. Everything I'm just saying. And we could talk extensively about Nazi Germany, but let's just make an entire point. I mean, almost the entire country became enchanted. The country that gave us Goethe and Bach. And so many wonderful ideas and thoughts and art. I mean, this is a basic talking point here when we're looking at that phenomenon. How did that happen? It's not because they all had the same exact structural amygdala size issues. I mean, give me a break. I hope I've made myself clear on that one. The higher probability that this is neuroplasticity. In fact, let me point to the exact concluding sentence of a study. Let me read it to you. This is one that looked at MRIs and the structures of the brain. It said, so the study concluded that the participants' political views shaped responses at a very basic level. The participants, the individual's political views shape their neurological responses at a very basic level. So at a very basic level, our political views shape the neurological responses. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't say the structural shape of the brain gives us the political views. That right there points to neuroplasticity. Whatever political view you're indoctrinated into and given and exposed to is going to shape your neurological circuitry. And then in turn, when you see political imagery given back to you, that circuitry is going to ignite differently than the brains of somebody who's spent their lifetime exposed to different views and ideas. You see, the basic thing is that back to all of that stuff that I've been talking about with ideology. The move to then say, I have scientific proof that your brain is inferior to mine and that's why you think the way you do. It describes all of the worst impulses and tunneling and ideological ossification that I've been describing this entire time. So it was just coincidental that I've been putting this together and working on it. And then yesterday, this example flies right into my face. And I hope I didn't bore you too much with that. I'm about to wrap this up anyway, soon enough. I was talking about how we don't see our own moves, how we don't see that we're in that tunnel, like the lady who's coming at me without thinking about anything that I was saying. Let's just go over some of that real quick. Let's just do a little bit of a basic review. I was talking about the symmetry between left and right. And when compromise gets recast as corruption and treason, and that's when the brakes really come off. So instead of having polite policy differences where we actually try to figure out what is possible, creating an art of the possible, our public disputes become rival blueprints for what actually counts as human life. All right, we dehumanize it. The people who disagree with us, they're treasonous, they're evil, and their lives become less valuable than ours. And so when one side moves to criminalize any alternatives, our institutions that mediate pluralism, like the courts, a free press, civil society, these things are just not merely weakened. They're obliterated. They're destroyed completely. So the route from grassroots zealotry to state imposition is two-way. There's the bottom-up enforcement and the top-down imposition. And they both produce the same endpoint. Systems where dissent is illegitimate because the system equates dissent with existential error. Again, back to the people who run it themselves. The committee, the tyrant, the autocrat. Law becomes just a matter of their own existence and survival and protection. Everything, any form of dissent, is an existential error. Meaning, you threaten the existence of the state and its leaders. Any dissent makes you an existential threat, and you must be eliminated. You have a system of state terror. I'm going to be talking about this idea of the bootlicker because there's a lot of especially young 20-something, really young men out on YouTube who don't have any idea what the concept bootlicker means. And they're laboring on building the architecture of the bootlicker state and bragging about it, and they don't even know what they're talking about. They don't even know what bootlicker means. So I have to really break this down to a really simple level for all the kids that need to be into, for all the little YouTube guys that are splashing around in the intellectual kiddie pool. I gotta try to lure them into the deep end and teach them how to swim a little bit, talk about the bootlicker thing. But what I'm going to be talking about there is when everybody's under the boot, when we reach the totalitarian point, it's a state terror. Every single person that you know and love is now a potential enemy. You see, anybody can be so, the compromat on every single citizen is so intense, and the terror and the threat so intense that children will be forced to rat on their parents. The most horrific things you can imagine. Hey, you, if you don't do this, if you don't choose between your daughter and your son, it's going to be all three of you, plus your wife. Stuff like that. There's nothing cool about a bootlicking society where anyone's under the boot, because when we start making a society where some people are under the boot, everybody's going to be under the boot. I'll get to that. So again, let's just go back to this. Why don't we see our own moves? Why don't we see ourselves as being trapped? Why do those YouTube boys say,
I'm not the bootlicker. I'm the one wearing the boot. I'm the one doing the stomping. I'm not a bootlicker.
Why do these YouTube guys like that? Perfect example I was just talking about. Why do they not get it? Why do they not see how trapped and how, I mean, uncool, but like just how really limited they are and how absolutely servile their thinking actually is? Why don't they see it? Why don't any of us? Again, let's look at it a little bit. There's the cognitive ease to it all. Stories that fit and make sense to us and give us all of that force of conviction and so-called proof, those fits are cheap to keep. So cognitive ease, number one. Number two, identity. We attach our identities to these ideologies. They become the badges. We become them. Our badges, our shields, our weapons. And when we abandon those things, when we abandon our identity, we feel like we're betraying something, betraying ourselves. It's brutal once we make it part of our identity. Then there's the social reinforcement. The groups that we find our identity in, our social life that forms out of it, it rewards the orthodoxy, our commitment to it, and it's going to punish any deviation from it. So yeah, once you've committed to being under the boot and once you've decided that you're an ideological warrior, good luck having your own thought at any given time. You have to follow the script now, young man. You have to follow that script from top to bottom. Any deviation from it, that's why all these YouTube people are like in constant feuds. All these YouTube influencers that are in the intellectual dark web, so what it's called, Rumble and YouTube, they're always in these stupid little dramatic feuds. It's because they're all accusing each other of various forms of betrayal. Yeah, wait until there's real power at stake here. You guys will be, knocking each other off, poisoning each other, like Stalin's inner circle and stuff. Okay, anyway, there's the rhetorical cost, too. Okay, nobody, particularly these guys who have already been on, ranting and flexing their ideological stances, no one's going to want to interrogate that once they've publicly stated everything, and they're not going to risk then what I was just talking about, even being put down by, oh, how dare my fellow YouTuber put me down. They're all mad at each other. But they don't want to pay the rhetorical cost. So they can no longer interrogate or be intellectually accountable at all. They have no intellectual honesty whatsoever. Because they make these statements, like Jordan Peterson, out of the spirit of ignorance. And boy, they dig themselves in really, really quick. But the point is, it's really terrifying to tell your own children that everything you've been saying for a really long time is wrong. Hey, I gave you the wrong framework, son. I've been full of shit for the last 30 years, and I've been thinking really hard about it, but I've just been too afraid to admit it. That's almost impossible for a dude to do. Which is funny, because that reminds me, here's a digression. Jordan Peterson does this shit all the time. The scientific studies that show why people have an ideological view or not. And he was recently talking about how liberalism, in direct contradiction to the other study I was just talking about, same thing, how liberalism is born out of fear, or was it fear? Anyway, liberal women fear something along the same lines. And my immediate thought was, yeah, right, Jordan, like conservative men are really prone to being honest about what they're afraid of. I mean, it was such a see, that's what I'm saying. All this stuff is not only is it motivated by bad intentions, dishonest intellectual pursuits, resentment, and ideological agenda, right? Not only is it like motivated for that, but it's just so idiotic and superficial that Jordan Peterson's rambling on and on and on about this study that shows that leftists have these and characteristics in their personalities, and it's just like, dude, well, how about right here on the surface? I've never met a conservative man that's going to admit to any of that stuff ever, or talk openly and honestly no matter what you do with them. And you as a psychologist should know that. And that should be right at the surface. But you're digging an ideological tunnel downwards, aren't you? So you can't even see the obvious shit right on the surface. Real talk. All right. Again, I touched on propaganda. Let's just talk about it real quickly. We characterize and we weaponize propaganda asymmetrically. So disagreeable material is propaganda, agreeable material is fact. And it's a rhetorical slight. We're talking about a lot of different rhetorical sleights here that preserve our ideas from scrutiny. So if the messenger is tainted, the message is dismissed. Attack the source, not the content. And the reflex is comforting but bankrupting. Just like it's comforting to see a scientific study that shows
everybody that disagrees with me has an inferior brain. It's just proof. It's scientific.
So it stacks us, all this stuff, stacks us into these curated information silos where reality is a fortified narrative. It gives us all the enemies to hate and shows us all the saints to claim. So the irony here in all of it, getting back to left and right, is that ideology, it can be conservative and revolutionary at once. It can conserve itself by exclusion and canonization. It can be revolutionary by seeking to reorder all of society. So some ideologies are going to wear tradition more of as an armor, and others are going to present as radical renewal. Nazis, tradition as armor. Bolsheviks, radical renewal. Carrying history forward. But both centralize authority. One appeals on the right, and this is what people get twisted all the time. Hello, Jordan Peterson and all your followers. On the right, the appeal is to the roots. And on the left, the promise is to a perfected future. Generally speaking. But both degrade when the end justifies the means. Small compromises become tactical, then necessary, then normalized. Compromises such as little erosions of the Constitution, little locks and bolts on the Constitution, little increments of defining deviancy down. So gradually, the extreme changes start to appear normal. And so what are we going to do about it? Okay, that's the question. What do we do about all of this? So I'm not making a call for some timid relativism, false equivalencies and all that. Some ideas are demonstrably harmful, evil, genocide, slavery, systemic oppression. They can be shown to be wrong and to be evil by just evidence and moral argument. Not all ideas are equal. But the claim that ideologies carry risks, like the totalitarian seed itself, this is diagnostic. It tells us that we must construct cognitive and institutional defenses. Like, I see it more as a cultural movement. That's what all the hyperbole and corniness and grandiosity of this, the Great Rehumanization, is intentionally designed to provoke. Just a feeling of a cultural movement, right? But we need one. And we need a cultural movement that makes constructive cognitive defenses and cognitive work, intellectual accountability, intellectual honesty. We need to make it, for lack of a better term, cool. We need to make it cool. We need to teach it. We need to cultivate intellectual hygiene. And even if that sounds really pedestrian and boring, it's really practical, and we can make it pretty exciting. But we have to audit our premises. Our premises, everything we think, all of our biases, audit. We need to solicit counter evidence and not to score rhetorical points. Okay, it's not about just this sophistry of trying to win arguments. But we can say, okay, the system is leaking here. We want to plug those leaks, those intellectual leaks, those holes. So we have to ask forbidden questions. And there are a lot of forbidden questions. We're not even allowed to ask certain questions in this ideological climate. But we need to play devil's advocate. I've got some friends that are great at it. And it's not easy to do. But we have to play an honest game of devil's advocacy. And we have to do it with earnestness. So humility, curiosity, skepticism, and a willingness to be surprised and to let go of our long-claimed identities. These are all anti-ideological practices. And they're really hard to do now, harder than ever, but more necessary now than ever. Looking at the 20th century in hindsight especially.
And I'm sorry if that bores you, you little YouTube guy.
So the first thing is just that intellectual work. The second thing is the institutional work and protecting pluralism in spaces that encourage pluralism. Okay, freedom of speech, really important. Independent media, really important. A decentralized civil society. So just get into your churches and your neighborhoods and your schools and act locally. Think globally, act locally. Really act locally. Decentralization is so important. People on the left and the right actually agree about that in so many different ways. So, legal checks, accountability. This stuff is the brick and mortar of the architecture of the pluralist society that we need to encourage. I'm not talking about sentimental niceties, okay? When we have multiple institutions that can name and discuss what truth is, and when we disperse power, it makes it harder for totalizing claims to harden and take over. Makes it harder to enact efforts that force everybody to think the same. Democracy, our Republican democracy, our democratic republic, for example, it's much more the voting thing. Vote, 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 vote. It's more than about tallying votes and getting people to vote. It's the structural arrangement of mutual restraints, cultural agreements, a certain level of cooperation, the art of the possible. Erosion of these restraints and the agreements upon them is the direct path to ideological dominance. A third thing, so the first again, intellectual work. The second, the structural pluralism, plural spaces. The third thing is more about morals and a moral reasoning. And we have to reclaim some human scale there. So ideology, it seduces us by turning moral choices into a sort of a math. It's part of that ideonaturalism I was talking about. Moral choices become math problems in the sense that we have to subtract all uncertainty. And then we add solving power to our little equations there. And that works, you see, that rationalization, the mathematics of our moral reasoning. It works until we have to decide who lives and who dies. So we have to insist on the human context. Our opponents, we can't turn everybody, we can't have scapegoats. Scapegoating, broadly speaking, don't scapegoat. It's hard for me to look at, like, let's say, the technological elite right now. They're like on my scapegoating urgency list. Like, I just feel like pointed at them, and I'm trying to pray and have grace and go about the criticism of certain people in our society in a way that doesn't scapegoat them.
Hello, Peter Thiel.
We have to make our opponents people with faces and histories. They can't just be ciphers and symbols. We have to look at people and see the humanity in them. And humanization like that, it's not sentimental. I'm not talking about sentiment. I'm talking about practical resistance to the reductionism that renders atrocities thinkable. Like, human beings are so awful. We can be so awful. Shut ourselves off from the true inner light, the true inner human being that interacts with the spirit. We can shut all of that off and live in a reality where we rationalize mass murder, ignore it, become okay with it. It's sin. Deep capture. I got a fourth thing too, okay? And that's let's demystify inevitability. That's part of that ideonaturalism. Stuff's not inevitable. When we see politicians and leaders speak like what they're trying to do is history itself, and that science mandates it, things like that, it's got to be a red flag. It has to be a siren right away. It's a warning. Probability can never be destiny. Tendencies are not laws of nature, laws of science. Our job is to demand margins of uncertainty. Uncertainty is so important. Leave some space open to interrogate. A little epistemic humility punctures the rhetorical balloon. Dissent can't be seen as irrational. Dissent, there always has to be a level of rational dissent. So, again, another caution about labels, all right? Obsessing whether Nazis were left or right, for example. Whether something is left or right and just, pinning something down. That is far less useful, far less intellectually useful, as just seeking to identify the mechanics of totalizing narratives. So I mentioned Jordan Peterson. For one thing, he actually had the complete and utter mendacity, audacity, gumption gall to say these words.
I don't know if anybody's ever done the research as to whether the Nazis were really left or right.
He said that. He said that. My grandfather was a historian who fought in World War II. There was literally more information about the Nazis the second that war ended than has been available about any historical regime in history, in all of history. It's pretty well documented where the Nazis are, and all the scholars and academics who studied that. I mean, that statement from Jordan Peterson is can really well, let's say, get my Irish up. What a stupid thing to say. But anyway, that's a perfect example of this. This dishonest trying to label left or right for ideological purposes in and of themselves. So Jordan Peterson is trying to do that because he's ideologically motivated to somehow give the appearance that we don't need to associate the Nazis with right-wing totalitarianism. He wants to distance that from conservatism, and absolutely, that move there is so transparent and ridiculous. Again, getting my Irish up, even thinking about it. But what this taxonomy does, what I'm talking about, it's simple, real propaganda. What Peterson's doing there, it's just tribal provocation. All right, so to keep ourselves really honest, let's just ask the question instead of trying to do that labeling that's already been done, already been settled with the Nazis, by the way. Done deal. We just need to ask, which movements centralize state power and how do they do it? Which movements dehumanize groups using narratives of destiny or nature, and how do they go about it? Which abolish plural legal orders in favor of party rule, and how do they go about it? These are the features that matter. Still, asserting historical facts, Nazism, to be clear, it's racialist, hierarchical, ultra-nationalist character. It doesn't erase the structural truth that extreme left projects, Stalin and Mao, use similar apparatuses of control and terror. So, in a nutshell, the fact that the Nazis were extremely right-leaning, ultra-naturalist, blood and soil, so on and so forth, that doesn't change the fact that Stalin and Mao used basically the exact same processes of control and terror. So you can scramble labels all you want and do it obsessively, but you're going to miss the diagnostic, the dynamics of absolutism, Dr. Peterson. Denying inconvenient placements for identity's sake is its own ideological symptom. Ding, 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 ding. Alarm, alarm, alarm. Again, the taxonomy, playing around with that itself, is just a tribal provocation. So anybody sitting here trying to say that they're,
well, I don't know if the Nazis were, or anybody's ever really figured out if they're left or right.
What the hell? All right? That's an ideological move in and of itself, a symptom of everything I'm talking about. So that brings us back. Every ideology bears a seed of totalitarian extension, especially when it acquires institutional force. So when it's backed by curricula, law, permitted vocabulary, silencing mechanisms. The institutions convert arguments into practice. Practices normalize the new normal. Bureaucracies, educators, neighbors, ordinary people, Everybody we know slowly begins to rationalize what once seemed intolerable, what once seemed absurd and even horrific, because the horizon shifts. Back to this remedy. It's got to be local and it's got to be patient. I mean, Jordan Peterson would like this, and he would be able to explain why, but it's about parenting. It's about schooling, editorial choices, cooperation, voluntary cooperation. Right, Doc? Boy, I'm thinking about Jordan Peterson a lot. I do, man. He's awesome. He's awesome in so many ways. Just what is he doing? Ideological. He's an ideologue. That's what it is. So, he could offer us a lot of actually good thoughts about some of this stuff, but some of these remedies, okay? Local, patient. Again, intellectuals who are willing to be unpopular, and ordinary people learning to do the hard art of tolerating ambiguity, of finding context, of doing a little bit of intellectual heavy lifting, taking off those little floaty wings and getting out of the shallow end, swimming over to the deep end, and losing a little bit of identity, perhaps, to do so. Staying with uncertainty is countercultural. All of these things I'm talking about. So, it's also moral. I'm talking about slow politics here. The art of the possible, stubborn, iterative, accepting compromise as human, righteous. Compromise is not a betrayal. You might worry that this might sap activism. No. Fight. Go ahead. Fight for what you believe in. But do it with humility and understand the importance of the pluralistic tactics that I've talked about. You got to be evidence-based. Respect the rights of others. Be institutionally aware. Iterative. Be able to change accordingly. So the error is purification. It's imagining politics as a cleansing force. It'll become a witch hunt. So I think reform and coming up with ways to prevent totalitarian thinking and to examine ideology, we have to imagine institutions that can correct without annihilating dissent. Pluralism is so important in our institutions. So again, let me just, well, again, I've kind of said this a little bit. I think I touched on this, but maybe I didn't. I don't mean to be so heavy-handed. So this is a little bit of a softer note. Ideology is not pure darkness, okay? We need to have stories, by the fire. We need narratives and stories that reorient ourselves, people need narratives to reorient themselves and to orient themselves. So ideology is the story by the fire. The key thing is to always see them as stories and not scientific, airtight, complete explanations. They're stories that can be open to amendment. Stories. Not every story can promise final salvation, especially if you're a believer in a traditional religion. I would say, and I will talk about it a lot as a believer, it's one of my main themes, keeping the belief from turning into a worldly ideology. Here's a useful ethic, okay? Here's a way to identify a useful ethic. If something is teachable to children and it's durable under adult scrutiny, it's worthwhile. That's a deeply conservative thing to say. If we can teach this to a child, if it helps them, if it's durable under adult scrutiny, it's a real idea. Don't hit each other. Try to share. All right, I don't want to oversimplify things, but basically, the tendency to be intrigued by ideologies, it's not it's not a horrible darkness. We just have to be wise. It's about wisdom and knowing that we're always going to be ignorant and susceptible to propaganda. There's always going to be a level of ignorance there. So yes, there is a real spirit of ignorance. But a framework cannot survive interrogation. It's not wisdom at all. It's just testing our loyalty. So there's some criteria for wisdom. Every ideological framework should be able to take some interrogation. If not, then we know we're in that trap. So let me just let's just go over a little checklist real quick. Think about the assumptions that we rarely challenge and challenge them. Hang out with critics that we like, people that we disagree with, but we enjoy spending time with. Let them stress test our thinking. Especially if there's somebody that we know actually thinks and spends time on thinking. If you know somebody who reads a lot and thinks a lot and you disagree with them, listen to them more. They probably know more than you, especially if they're older, spend a lot of time thinking, read a lot, have a lot of experience, and you don't read, and you don't think a lot, and you don't really care. It's mind-blowing to me how many people are basically politically illiterate, totally ignorant of politics, political systems, couldn't tell you about the levers of government at all, but they have strong political opinions and will argue about them. It's like, no. Stop. So, again, if you're one of these people, and you could say, if you honestly could say, I actually don't know, then don't have big feelings about it, okay? Don't have big feelings about things that are little in your head. Small, they have small knowledge about. Resist purity tests, okay? So, we need to have coalitions where people have different views, but broadly similar understandings. Like, we care about the same things. We want the best. We want the same things. We can have different views about how to get there. So we have to tolerate differences within our own ideological frameworks, on our own teams. We see that in our two-party thing glaringly, right up front. You look at the Democratic Party, you see an intolerance for certain things, dissension, and you see it with MAGA. It's intense now. We always have to try to match our moral claims to evidence. Avoid metaphysical certainties. So, and then this is the Great Rehumanization. We have to humanize consistently. Keep opponents as full people. Everybody has a history, a needs, circumstances. Everybody's a human being. So, I don't have magic cures. Just some practices that refuse the seduction of zero-sum truth. So, I'm not begging for complacency or cowardice. I'm just asking for a deeper courage. The courage to be wrong and to tolerate otherness. To repair rather than burn down institutions. Okay, it's a stubborn art, really. Okay, so ideas make the world, everybody. There's a big difference between the ideas and then rationalizing them into closed systems. Ideologies claim to be the world. They lock us in place. Respecting ideas means refusing to let any single logic become the skeleton of human life. And so this is an era of instant communication and rapid institutional pivoting. Pluralism and humility. Humanizing humility. These aren't romantic relics, okay? It's practical armor. We have to teach them, we have to practice them, we have to live them. They're the instruments that prevent politics from becoming cosmic destiny. So here's a final accounting. Diagnosing ideological danger doesn't mean we cannot commit to causes, okay? We can have our causes, but we should build commitments that admit correction, tolerate dissent, and insist on humanization. Let's hold our ideas with open hands. Let's organize institutions widely. Let's cultivate the habit of being wrong. Let's not confuse feelings force with proofs force. And the minute we do that, our ideas, they're no longer tools. They no longer build worlds. They're cages that claim the world and trap us in it. So cages, whether or not they're backed by theory gilded or not, they're still cages. So let me just give you a little summary. This has been a long talk. We're almost at an hour and a half. But let's just sum it all up. Ideas matter, everybody. Some ideas liberate, some harm. Ideology can be extremely dangerous because that's when an idea gets turned into a closed, self-validating system that excludes all nuance and begins to terminate the very existence of dissent and even the very people who express it. Ideological logic, it seduces us by appearing rational, self-authenticating. It's cohesive, coherent, and logical. We can trace its logic. Ideologies evolve into totalizing political projects, institutions of power, start to enable authoritarian outcomes. And it's common on both left and right. They share structural mechanisms when they go to the extremes. They share the mechanisms that centralize power and suppress pluralism, using the same thing, terror, basically, the machinery of the state. Psychological and social dynamics, back to the things we talked about, our sense of identity, the cognitive ease of adapting an ideology, and the social reinforcement behind it all. All of that blinds us to our own ideology. But we do have some defenses that we talked about: the intellectual hygiene, the institutional pluralism, human scale moral reasoning, resisting the rhetoric of inevitability. There were 4 things there. Practical checklist, okay? Name the premises, invite critics, protect contesting institutions, plurality, resist purity tests, especially within our own frameworks, on our own teams, and our own political parties. Stop it with the purity tests. Claims to evidence. Examine them. Proportion them. Humanize opponents. Humanize, humanize, humanize. And what's the aim? Fight injustice with humility and pluralistic strategy and avoid turning conviction into a cage. This is the Great Rehumanization. This has been a long one, and I'm going to close with the same things I always say. Another fix to all this can be found in the deep wisdom that we've been blessed with. Grace. Be the light of the world, the salt of the earth, sheep amongst wolves. Be shrewd and wise like a serpent, tough-minded. Be as harmless as doves, open-hearted, compassionate. Love thy neighbor. Do not conform to the patterns of this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. This is the Great Rehumanization. The next thing we're going to talk about is connected, and it's hypocrisy. I've talked about it before, but we've got to update it a little bit and dig in again. After we talk about hypocrisy, we're going to have a long talk about trauma. We'll start talking about trauma and some personal things. So we're going to get deeper and deeper. Thank you for joining me. It's a Great Rehumanization.
I blur distinctions of us and them. I don't know anyone deserving all the blame. I'm the problem, you're the problem. One conclusion can only remain: there is no solution outside of love. Outside of love, there is no solution outside of love. Outside of